Okay, we're recording.
There we go.
Family interviews in March of 2000, March 27, 2012.
Gotcha.
Lake Byron, South Dakota.
Lake Byron, South Dakota, with in
Beautiful
in the
Beetle
background.
County.
In the background. Well, you want to start by telling about what you remember about your ancestors? Maybe Fernando Ford coming here from.
Sure. We started in South Dakota. I guess our roots started in 1884 when my grandfather, Fernando Ford, rode out on the train from Chautauqua County, New York. And our family thought for years he'd walked out and carried the family Bible with him, but come to find out he'd read about Millette, South Dakota, and his uncle was a land agent out here, and they'd been conversing, and the uncle apparently convinced him that South Dakota was a place to be. So my granddad, Fernando, came out, as I said, in 1884.
So he didn't walk?
He did not walk.
When did you find this out?
Well,
This must have been pretty recent.
I found it out when I read his diary.
Okay.
Grandpa kept a very accurate diary for years. I think he had about 10 of them. And the one that I saw was the 1884 version, where part of his life in that year was in New York and part was here in South Dakota. And he did not homestead initially. He looked around. There's plenty of land for sale. In his diary entries, he talks of being over by Northville. And I wouldn't want that land as got too much clay or too much rock in it, or farther west the land had some alkali that would never raise a crop. So eventually he bought 2/4 sections of ground from people who had originally homesteaded. Later on he did homestead a quarter out in Potter County in the area around Gettysburg right now.
So that was land that had never been.
He broke
Plowed or
the sod. He broke the sod. But the Potter County part, he broke the sod. Now, he broke a lot of sod here in Spink County, but I can't say that he did for the 320 acres that he bought. I don't know if that had been previously tilled or not. And my mother's side, my granddad on that side came out from Iowa. He and his father before him worked on the railroad. My great-grandfather, if you check the birth dates of the children, the first children were born in the Dubuque area, and as the railroad pushed farther south and west, you see where each of the children were born. And, I don't know if the railroads stopped at those points or not, but I believe they had 10 or 11 children, but you can see all through Iowa.
Your mother's siblings. She had 10 or 11.
No, that would be my mother's father's sibling.
Oh, okay.
My mother's father and all of his brothers and sisters. Most of those folks in that family wound up in South Dakota, stayed in South Dakota. My granddad was a railroad man and worked for the railroad, the line that runs between north-south line that runs from Millette through Woolsey and farther south. His job was a coal tender for many years. When a coal train would show up, they'd elevate the coal out of the train into a large hopper, and then as other trains would come by that would need more coal for their engines, they would stop, and he would operate a mechanism where the coal would come tumbling out of the hopper into the coal car or coal portion of the engine, the little part behind the engine, so the steam engines could continue to chug on down the road. Typically those stops were every 8 to 10 miles or so. Part of that was to drop off cars for shipping of grain, and part of it was to service the engines. But that's my mom's dad and my dad's dad.
Well, tell me the story about how it was that he came to live in a boxcar.
Well, according to my Uncle Babe, my granddad never believed in paying rent. I suppose that's a luxury that came through with the dirty 30s when there were so many farmhouses and houses in town that were vacant because so many people left this area. The Great Depression of South Dakota was not a 1 or 2 year event. It was like a 10 to 12 year event where there were literally no crops raised. And people just gave up in desperation. They couldn't raise a crop and they couldn't retain their land, even the land that they had inherited. They couldn't pay the taxes on it, so the land reverted, ownership reverted back to the county where they lived. But Granddad Rostron did not believe in paying rent, and if someone wanted to extract rent from him, he would just move him and his family to another location. I don't have the details on how they came to live in a boxcar, but
this would have been way before the 30s, right? This would have been in the late 1800s.
No,
Because wasn't your mom a little girl when she
my
was
mother was born in 1914, and I'm not exactly sure when the Depression started here. It was in the late 20s.
and Uncle Babe was born in 1918.
And I don't know when my granddad supposedly made the comment that he didn't believe in paying rent, but it could be because of the shortage of housing, if nothing else. I don't know. It could be that he couldn't find a house for his family, and he had to be at work every day to service the engines that were coming through to make sure they had plenty of coal. And he just moved his family into a boxcar. Hopefully it was the summer when he did it, and not during the cold winter in South Dakota. But that was over in Benilla, South Dakota, where that happened.
And how long were they in the boxcar?
I don't know. I never got any.
Probably through the summer. That would be logical.
It would be too cold in a boxcar to live there in wintertime. I got the kids would get pneumonia, I would think.
Did your mom ever tell you about living in the boxcar?
No, she never did.
Okay. You just heard about this from
Well,
your
Uncle
uncle.
Babe told it, and it wasn't too terribly long before he died.
He was in his 80s when he told
Yeah.
us that story. But in that family, in my mother's family, there were 3 girls and 4 boys. And my Uncle Babe was the second youngest of that family. So the older kids had already moved away. And when the 2 youngest children, my Uncle Lyle and Uncle Babe, were with my granddad, so it could have been during that era that he chose not to pay any rent.
And Fernando, your dad's dad,
Yeah.
you said that he lost his farm during the Depression, is that right?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Fernando prided himself on being a good businessman, and he, in addition to the 2 quarters I mentioned that he had purchased in the late 1800s, and the quarter that he homesteaded in Potter County, he had several other acreages that he tilled. Well, even during the Depression, when there was practically nothing for horses or animals to eat, he raised 40 acres of potatoes to feed his livestock. It's kind of unusual that in today's day and age that people would even consider feeding livestock potatoes. But when you're farming with horses, you've got to keep your engines fueled, and that was the way he did it. But he owned a lumber yard over at Millette and was buying lumber and having it shipped in from Minnesota, Montana, Idaho, what have you. And he had there are pictures in the family that show the stacks of lumber around the home where my brother John now lives. Huge quantities of lumber, dimensional lumber and otherwise, stacked outside. And carpenters would used that lumber to build farmsteads, and Grandpa front-ended that. It was kind of ahead of his time. He felt a man's word was good. You shake hands with a person, they tell you they'll pay you. When their crops come in, they'll pay you. Unfortunately, the Depression hit, and no one had any crops coming in, so they had no money. So most of those farms failed, and my granddad was never paid for the building or for the lumber.
So is that what brought him under then?
Yes, I saw the mortgage. I believe it was $32,000 that he borrowed on 2/4 of land, mortgaged 2/4 of land to finance his lumber business. And in 1936, I want to say Farmers Home Administration, but that's not right. It's an organization that lives today. Oh, the Federal Land Bank called the loan in, and he didn't have the money to pay it, so he lost those 2/4 of land. And as a matter of fact, he basically lost everything. The same year my grandmother died in 1936, my grandma Bertha.
Wow.
It must have been a very tough year for him.
And so he moved in with your dad then?
No, my granddad had a house in town. Basically, that's how he ran his lumber yard out of that house. And my dad and my mother later moved in with him. When my folks were married in 1932, as I recall. And they lived in the country about 2 miles east of Millette, very close to Fernando's farm. And I don't know when they moved to town. I was born in 1940, and all I remember, my parents and my brothers and I lived with my granddad. And my dad later bought the house in town from my granddad. I don't recall the exact amount of it, but...
So how did he support himself then after he lost his farm, and he obviously lost the lumber business?
I can't answer your question. I don't know if he had assets that he sold off. I don't know. Maybe my dad became the primary breadwinner, because my dad farmed, since I could remember, farmed 3/4 for the Gaines family and 2/4 of land for the Dunker family. And as far back as I can remember, he farmed those 5/4 of land. So that must have been farming him in the early 40s or the late 30s. Maybe they made enough off of that to survive. But ours was a subsistence farm. We raised everything we ate. We had a large garden. My mother and my grandmother before her canned every fall. They canned vegetables, they canned meat. We always raised our own livestock, so we always had our own chickens and other fowl on the place. So I don't know how much you need to survive on that if you're raising your own food.
Right. So maybe the deal was that they moved in with Grandpa Fernando and they got a free house out of the deal, and then
they had free housing out of it. They eventually bought the house from my granddad.
Okay.
Yes, they got free housing out of it. When I was a boy, our house was heated by a kitchen range and a warm morning stove that they put up every fall in the living room. There was no heat upstairs, but when I was a boy, the only fuel we had was wood. Wood that we'd bring in from the James River, or when the Minneapolis-St. Paul Railroad went out of business, my dad bought a number of the railroad ties, I recall. We had a big old buzzsaw. I was a little guy. That buzzsaw must have had a blade on it 3.5 foot in diameter that would run off the tractor. And they would cut those railroad ties up, old railroad ties, and
Boy, those things are
and-
hard to cut to, aren't they? They're soaked in
Well,
creosote.
They were all those old oak ties, and I think they had to be all creosoted ties, or they wouldn't have lasted. But they'd been in place since I don't know when that railroad was built, but probably in mid to late 1800s, so.
That creosote pretty much dissipates and disappears through time though, with wear. That doesn't last forever.
So how did your mom and dad meet then? Were they growing up in the same town or what?
Call it.
My dad was the youngest of 10 children, and
Fernando had 10 children,
oh yes,
and what was his wife's name? Fernando's wife?
Bertha.
Bertha. Okay.
Bertha Adelaide Hatepick Schultz.
Oh,
Ford. Excuse me. I think they were quite proud of where they came from in Germany. And my grandmother was a small girl when she immigrated into the United States. She had one sister, her sister Martha, and Martha and her husband left this country in the fairly early 1900s and moved out to Oregon. But back to your question of how did my parents
How
meet?
did Gene? Your dad's name was Gene, right?
That's correct.
And your mom's name was Elaine.
Eileen.
Eileen.
With an A.
Well,
A-I-L.
as I said, my dad was the youngest of 10 children. They lived in Millette since they could remember. My mother was one of 7 children that moved to Millette when her father was transferred on the railroad from Tulare, South Dakota, to Millette. And as I recall the story, he came to Millette as a section gang lead. He was responsible for a section gang, whose responsibility was to go out and check the track to make sure the track was safe and properly aligned, and if there were any railroad ties that had deteriorated or rotted out, they were replaced, or if any tie plates were loose, they spiked them back into place. And my granddad was in charge of a crew that went out daily to do that. And kind of ironically, that was my granddad Rostron, Carl Rostron, and his oldest boy, my Uncle Doc, when he got to be about 15 or 16, went to work for the railroad. So, unlike a lot of folks during the Depression years, my Rostron family really had money. A lot of the farmers didn't, but they had 2 incomes coming into that household from my granddad and from my Uncle Doc. I don't think they probably spent it too well. As I said before, they had a little problem with Granddad wanting to pay rent, or not wanting to pay rent.
So do you have any theories on what he did spend his money on?
No theories. All I'm told was that he spent. He had. He had a date with a bottle every day. He liked his alcohol, and my Uncle Babe used to say no words ever struck him, disgusted him more than hearing his dad say, "Let's have another round on me." And I don't think the kids ate that well. My grandmother died when the kids were quite young. That is Granddad Rostron's wife. I believe she was 28.
What was her name?
Her name was also Bertha.
Okay.
She's buried over here at Hitchcock, South Dakota. Most of the Rostron family is buried over at Hitchcock. Matter of fact, we might go over there today or tomorrow. I'll show you the gravesite. That's only about 9 miles from here. As I said, when he got the new section job, moved to Millette, my mother was one of the 7 children, and she moved to Millette with him. And my dad was probably looked over at her and said, "There's a new girl in town."
So approximately how old would your mother have been at that time when they moved?
I don't know. I would guess that she would have been somewhere between 12 and 14, maybe 15.
Okay.
I know my mother went to high school 1 year, and in her second year, I remember her saying that she only had 2 dresses to wear, and she was so embarrassed wearing this. Then one got pretty threadbare, so that she really only had 1 dress that was nice enough to wear to school. So she thought it better just to quit high school.
Oh, wow.
And
An interesting little statistic. I have the 8th grade graduation program for Smith County. Brian's dad, his mother, and my mother all graduated from the 8th grade at the same time.
At the same time, huh?
Right.
Huh.
Yep. My mom was born in 13, his mom, and his dad was born in 11. My mom was born in 13, his mom was born in 14.
So even though they were 3 years apart, they finished 8th grade
Yeah,
at the same time?
Yeah, they did. His mom started school young. My mom started school young. His mom was born in May, my mom was born in November. And his dad was born in July, but his dad also had rheumatic fever.
rheumatic fever.
Rheumatic
Yes.
fever, so he lost a year of school. You know, so he was sick for a year, he was out of school. And with our mothers both starting school early and him missing a year, they wound up graduating at the same time.
That is interesting.
And also not sure that Dad didn't lose part of another year of school for, he told me once he had a superintendent, the name was Forbes, and Mr. Forbes caught him carving his initials, or writing initials on the bottom of a drawer, and Mr. Forbes told my dad, Mr. Ford, you stop what you're doing or I'm gonna suspend you from school. And my dad told me, he boastfully, that he looked at him and said, Mr. Forbes, you can go to hell. So I suspect my dad may have been kicked out of school for a short period of time.
In grade school.
Okay, well now we understand the age gap here. That's probably a pretty good introduction to, because the other stories I've heard suggest that your dad was a pretty ornery character.
He was
Strong-willed.
he was a very interesting character. There are certain of his siblings that believe that Dad's independence came a lot from being the baby of the family and being quite sick. My grandmother Ford was quite protective of her youngest child, and according to some of the stories I've heard in the family, that maybe he was treated with kid gloves compared to some of his older siblings were treated growing up. In other words, he was probably spoiled.
Okay. So was Fernando's personality similar to your dad's, or was Fernando cut from a different cloth? Because you knew him growing up. I mean, you shared a bedroom with him. So.
Yes, I do.
But by then he had become a very gentle man.
Quite gentle. My granddad had a rather fiery temper. I'm told that he appears twice in the annals of South Dakota for disputes with his neighbor. In one case, his neighbor's bull came into my granddad's herd, registered livestock, and my granddad told the neighbor, "You keep your bull out of my herd." And the neighbor apparently didn't do what he wanted to do, so granddad went out one day where the bull was, rode up to him with a horse and shoved a pitchfork into the bull's belly, and the bull ran home. And granddad took his horse and rode over his neighbor's house and put his foot in the belly of the bull and pulled his pitchfork out and went home. I guess the bull died.
The bull ran with the pitchfork still in it.
And well, that's the
Makes for
way
a
the
good
story.
story anyhow.
That's the way it was told to me. The other time, same neighbor had hogs that kept getting in my granddad's corn, and he told the neighbor, "I want you to get your hogs, keep your hogs out of my corn." Apparently, that didn't work, so he took his 30-30 and went out and shot and killed every one of the hogs. The neighbor didn't like it and sued him. I understand that Granddad lost on that one too. So.
Okay, so there could be something coming in the bloodline.
The only thing I can tell you for sure that about my granddad is when I was a small boy up to the age of 5, I used to sleep with him, and I can recall him jostling me and quit your kicking. I'm not kicking, Grandpa. Quit your. He rarely swore, but that was an exception because he could tell me to quit your damn kicking. But, apparently, I must have been moving my feet and disturbing him as sometime in day.
And how old would he have been at that time?
How old would he have been then?
Yeah.
Oh, I was probably. I was 11 when he died in 1951,
And he was how old when he died?
93.
Yeah.
So he probably would have been 84, 85, 86, someplace in there.
Quit your kicking.
But he was, yes, he wanted things to go his way.
Okay. So, did your dad ever tell you stories about growing up on the farm, or not too much, other than the story about getting probably suspended from school for?
Yes, I heard several stories, but most of them related to horses. And my dad had no love for horses at all, which is exactly the opposite of Marilyn's family. They loved horses. But my dad would not have a horse on the place because of his experience with horses as a child.
So what were these were they traumatic experiences with horses, or?
I don't recall anything specific.
We're talking about a marshmallow wrapped in barbed wire, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. That
Okay.
was Grandpa. A marshmallow wrapped in barbed wire.
Yeah, I don't remember anything right now very specific. No, with horses. All I know is that he felt the tractor was a great invention, and as long as there was a tractor available, we would use tractors. We would not use horses. But Marilyn's family, your dad kept horses on the farm forever.
Well, and your dad was fascinated with engines.
That's true.
You know, that makes a lot of difference. If you've got a fascination with engines, that you can do something with, and
Yeah.
whereas my dad did not have a fascination with engines, but he had a love for animals.
So did you ever hear stories about your parents courting one another while they were in school together, or?
No. Did you ever hear stories about your parents?
Oh, yeah.
On the recording?
Yep, I did. I did, but I didn't know if with your mom and dad, and they were married very young.
How old were they when they got married?
I think Mom was 18, I think Dad was
When
21.
did your dad start courting?
I was thinking she might have been a little younger than that, but she probably was 18. I don't remember what year they were married.
Well, my mother was,
They were married in September.
they were married in 1932. My mother was born in 14. That's 18. She was 17 and about to be 18, but.
But yeah,
But she would have been out of school for 2 or 3 years at that point.
well,
And she didn't
quit
finish high school.
Yeah, she didn't.
She had quit high school in her sophomore year. It's kind of interesting with my mother. My mother was very well self-educated. She was very well read. She'd get her hands on anything and read it. She had the complete volumes of Shakespeare, all of Charles Dickens' works. Every time you saw my mother when she was working, she was reading.
The funny thing that they would tell about when the Jehovah's Witnesses would come to the door with their Watchtower magazine, and she'd invite them in, and she could smoke them, because she knew that Bible from beginning to end. And start quoting chapter and verse, and she could just quote them right back.
Well, that's true, because she looked forward to him coming. most of us, we'd see the Jehovah's Witness coming, that doomsday was coming around the corner, and we're going, hell and damnation, you got 100 years, or 100 days left to live, and it'll be the end of the earth. Well, she'd invite them to come in, and they'd quote some part of scripture that, in John chapter 2, verse 22, it says such and such, that we're all gonna perish from the earth. Well, that's fine, but I believe if you go a little bit further, you look on the apostles, you'll find that it says this, so just exactly the opposite. But she looked forward to coming up, and that was a good interchange for her.
What about, so was your dad a big reader too, or?
Dad read all the time, but Dad's interests were completely different. He wasn't one to read the books and novels. He was more into newspapers, magazines, that sort of thing. And bear in mind, when we were raised, this is all pre-television, so your major source of news was printed media.
What did your mom do after she left high school, but before she got married? Did she?
I think she helped to raise the other kids. I don't know exactly how old my mother was when Grandma died, but I think she was around 11 or 12.
So she kind of became the mother.
Became one of the caregivers. I mean, my mother wasn't the oldest child.
But she was nurturing, whereas Aunt Irma was not a nurturing individual, she was
Aunt
more
Irma
like
being
she-
her
older
older sister.
And I think Mom's oldest sister, Lois, married very young and left very young. I think she was like 16 or 17 when she married and left. So that pretty much left Aunt Irma and my mother to take care of the younger children.
And then, did your dad finish high school before he
Well,
started working on the farm? Okay.
well, yeah. Yeah, apparently Mr. Ford let him back into high school.
I didn't even know if your dad
Oh,
graduated from high school or not.
many times my dad asked me if I ever found that desk, that he wrote his name on the bottom.
Well, I thought that was in grade school. Oh, okay.
And so he finished. He graduated from high school. Would have been about 18, and he was 3 years older than your mom.
Mhm.
But then they didn't get married for like 3 years after he graduated, because you said he was 21, she was 18.
Well, he
Yeah,
probably went
but-
and worked with
I
WPA
think-
and things like that.
What's that?
Did he work with WPA at that time? Was he doing that sort of work?
Well, he worked WPA, but I think they were married when he worked
Oh, okay.
WPA.
Okay, I didn't know what year.
Remember, Dad didn't graduate from high school when he was 18. He was like 20 or so when he graduated from high school.
Oh, that's
My-
right,
my
because he was
mother-
older, yeah.
My mother would have been 18 when she graduated from high school, but as I said, I think she quit school in her sophomore year.
Yeah, and I think WPA probably would have been, if he was born in 1911, WPA probably didn't come around until
He was a
at
little
least
older.
33, 34, because FDR wasn't elected till 32, so.
Okay.
I think
So-
most of those programs took place in 33 to 37 in that range. I don't know when the WPA came in, but nearly everyone out here in central South Dakota worked WPA. If you hadn't been for WPA, I don't know what would have happened to the country, but the standard pay was $1 a day, and it was a full work day. But many of the roads that were graded up, the old township roads, county roads that were just trails on the prairie were graded up by the use of mules, horses, and a slip scoop or tumble bug, I think that was a nickname for him. But a man would operate this scraper, if you will, until it would fill up with dirt, and it would trip it up in the air, and the horse or mule would continue to move with it until they got it where they could dump it. And that's how the roads were graded up. The Armadale Road was a big WPA project, which is an east-west road that I don't know the western terminal, but if you go up to Highway 281, 3 miles north of Millette, You find that road goes all the way over to the Moonshine Trail at north of Brentford.
So when your parents got married then, so it would have been 1932, your dad's 21, your mom's 18, where did they live? And did your dad start farming immediately, or what was he doing at that point, do you know?
As far as I know, they started farming immediately, and they were farming, as I said earlier in our conversation, about 2 miles east of Millet, 2.5 miles east of Millet, and about 1.5 miles north. I'm not real sure, but that may have been ground that my great-grandfather Schultz owned at one time. I don't know. The Schultzes had left the country by then, but
Okay.
the only Schultz that remained behind was my grandmother, who was married to Fernando.
But your dad did not own the land that he farmed on, he was just renting
I don't-
land
I think you're right. I
or
don't think that I-
sharecropping maybe?
Yes, I'm sure that's what he did. As a matter of fact, to the day he died, the only land that my dad ever owned was a farmstead that we had on the edge of Millet within the city limits. But all the land that he farmed was rented ground, and he rented on 1/3 and 2/3 crop share basis. The landlord paid the taxes, and the person farming the ground paid all expenses, and when the harvest came in, they shared the harvest 1/3 to the landowner, 2/3 to the farmer who did the work.
And the farmstead in Millet, so that was actually land that your grandpa Fernando had, that then your
That's
dad
correct. That's
purchased from him.
That's correct. And it really, we call it the farm, but they're really outlots for the city of Millet. Why they call them outlots rather than city lots, I don't know, but that's a term that they use on the plat maps of the city.
So you've described like a chicken coop near the house. Was that within like a stone's throw from the house there in Millet, or was it further away, or?
Yeah,
You know where the garage sits, where we drove in the
Yeah.
yard?
Garage.
Okay, all of that yard that we drove across, that was part of that land, and then where that garage sits, directly north of that was the little chicken coop that was right there. And where the garage sits, there used to be a big old barn there. Real tall, narrow barn.
And did you have a vegetable garden there in that same piece of property too, or?
Yes, we did. Our vegetable garden was on the east side of the house.
Where we drove across there yesterday.
Pardon?
Right there in front of Mark's place, where we drove across through that lot there.
Well, that was one of the outlots. That outlot and the north outlot were part of our garden, but that was a big part of our garden. Because we'd alternate crops every year. The south lot might be potatoes one year, and the east outlot would be sweet corn. Then the following year, they'd reverse it, where the sweet corn would be raised on the south lot, potatoes would be raised on the east lot. On the far north outlot, we planted popcorn. We normally planted about, I would estimate there's about 5 acres in there. We plant that popcorn every year. And with 4 boys that like popcorn, that was something we really enjoyed.
Now,
In addition to that, we had a vegetable garden, and that is not corn and not potato, but a vegetable garden to the west side of the house. And always enjoyed it when we come in there and plow that up every year. It seems so unusual to have the tractor or the big machinery right next to the house plowing up that road.
so about what year was it then that your folks moved in to Fernando's house? Was it before you were born, or?
I don't know. I don't know when it was. I would guess it was sometime during the Depression, late during the Depression. I don't know, and there's no one I know that I can talk to that could tell me.
Okay.
Hey Dad, can I ask, going back to when your parents got married, where were they married?
Maria, I don't remember. It was It was a small town in South Dakota, and I can't remember. It was a town like Miranda or Burden or something like that.
Be probably in that Bible that's out there on the.
I'm sure it's in the family, it's in the family Bible there
And that's right out there on the desk beside Dad's computer. And I don't remember. I should know. I'm sure your mom and I may have talked about that somewhere along there.
I'm sure it's written down in the family Bible.
So would you describe by the time you have recollections of it, were your parents a happily married couple, or?
Oh, you bet,
Mm-hmm.
you bet. We had a very happy household. Ours, because it was Grandpa's house to begin with, our house was the meeting point for the whole clan. Dad was, as I said, one of 10 children. 8 of them survived. My dad's Uncle Matt was killed while riding on a tractor when he was 19. A shotgun that he was carrying, a tractor discharged and shot him in the armpit, and he bled to death.
Oh, jeez.
All the rest of the family, when they'd come back or come in, they'd always come to our house, or to Grandpa's house, if you will. My 2 of my aunts lived on the West Coast, and they would make it a point to come back fairly regularly. I saw them every 2 to 3 years, I believe. I had one aunt, my Aunt Florence, lived down south of Dolan, and we either went to Dolan or they came to our house several times a year. And in the fall of the year, when we go on vacation, my Aunt Florence and her husband Leon would nearly always go with my dad, my mother, my Uncle Henry, and Aunt Hazel. We'd vacation together wherever we go, whether it be to Canada or northern Minnesota, or one year we went to the West Coast. It was a big deal that we always took a vacation in the fall.
Now, were your parents, were they raised in a strong religious background, or was religion important to either of your folks? One more than the
I'll
other?
talk to that first, and I'll let Marilyn talk about her family. My grandpa Fernando was a devoutly religious man. He described himself as a Puritan, and he read the Bible to his family literally every night. I can remember my dad snorting about it as if he were here today. Had to sit there and listen to that man read from the Bible every night. It almost sounded like one of our own teenage children, but this was my dad talking when he was an adult, 40 or 50 years old, complaining about having to listen to Fernando. We have Fernando's Bible here, and as I said earlier, that the family thought that Fernando had, or some members of the family thought Fernando had walked from Chautauqua County, New York to South Dakota and carried that big Bible with him all the way. I'll bring the Bible out here in a moment and show it to you. He'd been a lot stronger man than I am if he could lug out a doggone Bible. But 1,500 miles, they must weigh 30 pounds. But anyhow,
So it sounds like your dad maybe had a little reaction to the.
my dad probably had a little, yes, a little. For every, what do they say? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's, I think, is what Dad got. And I don't know about my mother. My mother always thought it was important that that everyone have religion. And my dad would kind of snort about his sister, who was the only one that converted to Catholicism in the family. Why, they get up there, they don't know what they're doing, they go to church, and the priest is up there, he's talking in a language they can't even understand. What in the world do they go for? They can't understand what's going on. And my mother would look at him and say, well, I personally believe that anyone that has a religion is better off than someone that doesn't, because when things get really tough, who do they pray to?
Right.
So did you go to church regularly as a family then, or and what church did you go to?
Well, I'll speak for me first. I was a reluctant Christian. uh, I thought going to church was okay, mostly because my cousin Jughead and I were very good, close buddies. And he lived 3.5 miles from town, and if his parents came to town on Saturday night, which they did every Saturday night, we would beg to see if he could stay overnight. And if we would agree to go to Sunday school the following morning on Sunday, then he could stay overnight. So the only way that the two little kids could figure out a way of staying together overnight was to agree to go to Sunday school.
And the church was close enough, they could walk to Sunday school.
And,
Gotcha.
well, it was a long ways away. It was about 3 miles uphill in deep snow.
4 blocks.
12 months out of the year. But anyhow, and then in the summertime, we would agree to go to Bible school, same terms. But I'll salt that a little bit with something I'm writing right now. Part of the motivation there was, again, to get him to stay overnight. Also, he could help me do my chores, which I thought was kind of a neat deal. Two of us doing chores, they go a lot better, a lot faster than one do. But as a young man, I was a reluctant Christian. I wound up going on Sundays and Bible school, mostly because my mother thought it was a good idea.
And did your dad go with the family too, or did he stay home?
No. The only time the local Methodist church saw my father was if someone married or someone died. If you weren't getting married or weren't dying, don't bother Dad because he wasn't going to go. Now, you could talk about your family.
You're going to wait till Michael's done with you.
Okay, well we can turn to
Well,
the
no,
Bebos and
this
the
is-
Petersons and the.
Well, it's so funny, the one thing that right out of the blocks that an interesting thing is, his father had 10 children in their family, my father had 10 children in his family. His mother had 7 in her family, my mother had 7 in her family.
Nice symmetry there.
Isn't that interesting? However, and my brothers and sisters, my dad's family were all full blood brothers and sisters. Whereas with my mother, my granddad was married 3 times. But his first wife, they were in Minnesota, and his first wife died of TB. Spent some time in the sanatorium, I guess that's what they called them, with her, and then she passed away. Well, then his second wife, with whom he had 4 children, and she died of TB.
Oh,
Yeah, second one died of TB. Which
was Grace
was that?
one of the
No,
4 children?
No, that was the first wife he had no children. Second wife he had,
And what was his name?
Olaf
Martin Olaf
Peterson.
Peterson.
Yep.
Gotcha.
So then he had Clifford and Irvin were his sons, and then Lydia and Bessie were the daughters.
Okay.
So they had those 4 children. Well, and then the second wife passed away, and I think Bessie was probably about 10 or maybe she was 10. Maybe she wasn't that old. I'm not sure how old the kids were when the mom died. But then my grandmother came out from Minnesota to keep house for my granddad and to help take care of these children. But his sister, Emma, and the reason they got a hold of my grandmother in Minnesota was Grandpa's sister, Emma, was married to Will Nyberg. Will Nyberg's niece was my grandmother. So she came out.
She came out to be the housekeeper.
Housekeeper for this man and helped
what was her name?
Swea. Boy, just drawing a blank. Pardon?
Is it Nygaard?
Swea Nyberg,
Okay.
that's right. Where'd my mind go? Right there.
So Swea Nyberg comes out to be housekeeper
Yep,
for
Olaf
Olaf
Peterson.
Peterson.
Yeah, his name was Martin Olaf, but he always went by Olaf or M.O.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyway, and then the boys were older, and Clifford was always good to my grandmother. And Irvin was a hateful sort of a character, and he wasn't good to her. But then Aunt Emma, who was married to Grandma's uncle, took the two little girls, Lydia and Bessie, and she actually raised them, yes. So they were with her most of the time, so my grandmother was there taking, she cooked the meals.
Taking care of the boys.
Yeah, keep house. She basically was a housekeeper and cook because they had land to farm and my granddad owned land. And he had a gravel pit on his land, which was a big money, generator. But then my grandmother had a little girl, I don't know, well, she cleaned house for him, and then I think when, I don't know how long, maybe a year or two later, after she came out there, then they got married. And they had a little girl, and she died. And then a short while later, my mom was born. And after my mom was born, Grandpa and Grandma had another little girl, and she died. Apparently crib death is what I think they determined that the babies died of. But
So was Grace the only one
the only
that survived from that marriage?
Right, so my granddad had 4 children with his second wife and 3 children with his third wife.
But only
But
Grace
only
survived.
5 survived out of the group, yeah.
Okay.
Grandma was the only one there. But she and Bessie were very, very close. And they were back and forth a lot. And
So was there any hint of scandal in this whole
it never,
marrying the housekeeper thing?
no, I never, if there ever was, it didn't come forth. I would imagine in the community, yes, there probably was a whole heck of a lot of scandal. You bring a young woman into your house.
What was the age difference between those two?
Oh, big age difference. He was 25 years older.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So she would have been maybe 18,